Is Dan Connelly. I was born in 1930 in a little coal mining village in central Pennsylvania by the name of Branchdale. I entered the Army in 1947 at age 17, and after basic training I came to the 82nd Airborne Division here at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Subsequently I did a tour in the Leadership Academy in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and returned to Fort Dix for separation in 1950 when President Truman extended everyone due to the outbreak of the Korean War. Assuming that if I were extended for that purpose I should get involved in it, and I re-enlisted for the Korean War, or for Korea, with the proviso I would return to the 82nd Airborne Division when I got back. At the time I arrived in Korea, I was a staff sergeant, and I was assigned to the 7th Infantry Division, and through the process to the 17th Infantry Regiment. I arrived in Korea in February, early March of 1951. I was a staff sergeant at the time and was assigned to the 7th Infantry Division. Within the division I was assigned to the 17th Infantry Regiment and subsequently to G Company of the 2nd Battalion. When I arrived as a young sergeant, I was immediately assigned as a platoon sergeant to a platoon of youngsters. Normally the TONE is about 46, 48 people. This one had 32 to my recollection. They had all been exposed to combat and I had not, and the initial problem was to ensure them that I respected what they knew and how they did it, but I would have to make decisions and they had to help me, and it worked very well. They were fantastic young people. The unfortunate aspect was that they were all there longer than I and would eventually be rotated home. They had established a point system that required people to leave when they obtained a certain number of points. On occasion there would be a lieutenant assigned, usually for a very short period of time. There were not very many lieutenants available, I don't suppose, and they needed them for other duties, or some were wounded, some were killed. I never had one long enough to really establish a platoon leader, platoon sergeant relationship, and therefore I was the pseudo platoon leader for all of my career until I subsequently got commissioned. Introducing myself to the platoon of, as I mentioned, approximately 32 people, maybe 8 or 9 of them were Katusas, the Korean augmentation support units. And that was because replacements were hard to come by for our American soldiers. Battle casualties, heat and cold injuries, and all kinds of other normal maladies kept everyone under strength. So 32 was an approximate number, and only about 24 of them were American soldiers. The Koreans were eager. They were willing to do anything if they understood what you wanted them to do. I did not, for my part, make any effort to try to communicate verbally with them. They followed some of the soldiers' directions who could speak a little bit of Korean, or hand signals, or however, but they were to a degree effective replacements. They did not man any of the automatic weapons. They carried carbines or rifles, whatever we could provide them, and they tried to act as a portion of the platoon, or as an integral part of the platoon. They generally, though, like all peoples, will congregate together. When we were on a break, they would gather together and sit together. They ate together and things like that, and frequently they would disappear together because they were not bound by our code of conduct or our discipline. At that time, the platoon, the company, and the battalion, in fact, was in a semi-defensive position in reserve after having been up north over the bad winter that we were still experiencing some of, and had withdrawn and were in reserve and refitting and rearming for future battles and orders that were to be received. We were located on a series of small knobs not too far from the east coast of Korea at that time. The weather was still cold and miserable, but it was breaking spring soon. The weather in Korea is one of two things. It's always either very bad or very good for short periods of time. The first indication I had of how things would go was when we received orders to move out on the following morning, not being told where we were moving out to or what we were going to do. But I did learn that the issuance of a steak and egg breakfast was an ominous sign that we were going somewhere to do something. We loaded trucks, and again I paid little attention to location or terrain or scenery. It was cold and miserable, and I was concerned about my responsibility for the lives of young people who obviously had more experience than I did, and not knowing where exactly we were going, but I had an inkling that it would not be a walk in the park. The first action we had was not terribly trying. We were in line with the battalion conducting an assault on a place called Needle Eye. It was a mountain or a hill with a hole in the top of the rocks that looked like the eye of a needle, so they called it Needle Eye. And it was, as battles in wartime go, it was uneventful for me. We did our job, we got shot at, I was glad to have survived, and my people performed well. I learned that I could be confident in they knew what to do if they were told in time and given the right leadership. From that point on, as I recall, we moved forward. We seemed to be chasing all the time. Long walks during the daytime, frequently taking fire, never at my level knowing exactly where it was coming from, hitting the ground, crawling in ditches, waiting for instructions and moving forward. Over a period of time I gained all the confidence that I needed to lead these people. Information would arrive and one or two of them would have to depart, and we would receive a newbie or a newcomer. I had one incident that required my decision making immediately, at least it was in my mind that it did. They had a policy, as it were, of taking the newest man and attaching to his backpack or around his neck a panel, the chartreuse panel that was used for helicopter landings. It was about 10 feet long and maybe a yard wide, and they were placed on the ground in an X for the helicopters to land, because helicopters were just coming into their own as a weapon of war. But the problem with the panel man was that he was always new, brand new usually, and he would lead the assault unit a little bit out front so that the air support would be able to see where the front edge of our battle line was. Many times, if not all the time, he either got wiped out or badly wounded. I did not think that was a good policy. It was not fair to the soldier, and I don't know that we should have allowed it to go on, and so I eliminated it. Aside, our good friends in the Air Force, they either hit or didn't hit what we wanted to every time they came by, so it didn't really have any effect on the conduct of the war. As we proceeded, I had many scrapes and scratches we got into. I recall one long patrol I went on when the lieutenant in S2 showed me on a map that it was only about 2 or 3 inches long, the distance I was traveling on the map. But on the ground it appeared to be maybe 8 or 9 miles round trip. one of my more interesting assignments was one night in a defensive position after we'd secured a location and we had dug in pretty well on the position. A patrol from a neighboring unit, I think it was E Company, led by Lieutenant Manio Inizuka, was out on a patrol, and they had radioed in. They were in front of our position down in the valley and were in big trouble. And I was instructed to take a patrol down and try to extricate them from it. It was a miserable night. It was cold and raining and drizzling. We got organized with the command post always urging me to get on with it, and it doesn't, you can't start a patrol or get it organized in jig time. You have to do it right. But by the time we got down, halfway down, the point man held us up and said he heard noise in front. We found his location we could lay down in or hide, and I crawled forward and identified the voices as Americans, that it was the lieutenant and his platoon. They were coming our way and looking for a way up the mountain. I could not, from the flares that were being fired in the valley, see any enemy or anybody in close proximity to his position, so I told him to come on, and we handheld, pulled him up from the location they were in and held him up to the mountain. The reason that was interesting to me was because the way we got the mission and the fact that headquarters was impatient to get it on. Not that we could have been sitting there loaded and locked ready to go on a patrol. We were not. We were in a defensive position, and they wanted it done right now. Well, you take one soldier from each position, you determine what kind of weapons you want to take. I took a BAR in this instance. You have to have your radio man, has to be summoned, and you got to get the right equipment that you're required to use or you plan to use, and get everybody briefed. And that was one of the eye-openers in my case. I thought that was a good learning point, and from that time on I made minimum preparations always to be ready to go, even though it would take some preparation time. I wanted equipment where it was easily accessed, soldiers alerted, knowing that if I call that we should assemble and we need to do certain things. And we had little policies of one man stays in the hole and one man comes out. They could figure that out for themselves, who goes when. And I didn't have any more trouble with that kind of a thing. I did take other long patrols, but that one opened my eyes, because I did not panic, but it sounded to me like they wanted me to panic, and I was too new in the game to let that ride.
Good.
Subsequent to that little episode, I was prepared and had time to get ready one evening to take a platoon patrol. They wanted a platoon-sized patrol, which was too big. And my mission was to locate the juncture of the North Korean and Chinese armies. Why anyone wanted to know that was not for me to be concerned about. But I was to go out, and taking two translators or two interpreters with me, they would identify the language of the enemy. To hear the language of the enemy, one must get pretty close. They were trying to establish where the Chinese army and the North Korean army joined or were close to each other, or whatever significance that would have, which of course was important. The problem with the whole operation was, when I started, I took two of my squads. We got properly prepared. We were notified that we would have a flamethrower attached to us, which was interesting, but we didn't argue with it. We got the flamethrower. We had also assigned two what we referred to as chogi bearers. They were Korean Katusas type people and they would carry the litters, 4 to a litter. So I had 8 of them, two stretchers. Then S2 wanted a man to go along, and a couple other people that needed to be involved. By the time I had my 2-squad platoon ready to go on patrol. It looked like a half a company. And we set out, and it was noisier than I would like. I had a difficult time keeping everybody quiet. By the time we had gotten started down the slope, it was breaking dusk, or turning dusk. And the further we went, and of course we had to go down the front side of the mountain, there were still some snow patches on the ground, and it was again cold. It's always cold. And it was more difficult than it should have been because we had too many people. One soldier, who it was, maybe one of my own, I'm not sure, dropped a steel helmet, and it rattled on the rocks, and that echoed around the mountainside there for a few minutes. My own people did not have helmets, but the Katusas did, and the attached people had them. The man with the team with the flamethrower had helmets, so I don't know whose helmet it was, but it made a lot of noise. We got down into the valley floor, and I organized and checked out and made sure I had everybody. I had the litters and the flamethrower man stay back in what I consider to be a secure place, and I took the rest of the people forward to see if we could do this locating as we were directed. We did. We found it. It was not, in my mind, I could not say for sure if we found the juncture or the joint point where the Koreans and the Chinese met. We started getting fired on. Mortar rounds started coming in, and the two interpreters immediately pointed and identified, telling me that to one side was the Koreans and to the other side was definitely the Chinese. I always suspected that they just wanted to get out of there because there was no way I could have identified who was who, and I was not inclined to want to stay there either, and it was getting pretty bad. One of my lads got hit in the shoulder, and a mortar shell fragment took out one of the Katusas, but we took him back with us, and I told him to pull back, and we went back up to scrambled back up the mountain. Took a little incoming from during our flight up there, but fortunately I don't think the enemy knew exactly where we were going up the mountain because it was really dark by this time. And I reported later to S2 the approximate location of where I thought these two armies met. I am not to this day sure that that was the place, but that's the information I got, and it was good enough for the interpreters. It was good enough for me, and they accepted it, so I suppose that was the mission accomplished. The bad weather eventually turned good, and the springtime was not hard to put up with. It was fairly warm. A point that should be made is the equipment that we had, or that the unit had, was not always adequate for the season and for the terrain, actually, sometimes. Later on, we started to receive the proper equipment or clothing for the cold weather, but in the first winter, what I observed when I got there, the troops that had gone all the way to the Yalu and back were not as fully protected from the elements as they could have been or should have been, based on what we have learned since. But during the early part of May, I guess, in 1951, we were on the attack. Had not met any resistance, but the battalion was spread out. One company was in reserve, and we were next to, I believe it was the Marine Corps on one side and the 2nd Infantry Division on the other. And we were moving along, climbing and scrabbling around, trying to get up into position. We took one little mountain after another, and then finally we were halted with resistance by the enemy. This time they were Chinese. They'd gotten pretty far south, and the dreaded call of 3rd Platoon Leader forward, and I ran forward to get the instructions. My instructions was to take the platoon and assault what was determined to be a machine gun position that was holding up the whole front line. I slithered back down and got my people together and told them we were going to move to a certain position, spread out, and when I gave the word, we were going to assault that knob. And they moved well, and we got in position, and the time that I had been given to make this move, coordinate with the artillery and the supporting fire had arrived, and I gave the hand signal and I took off. Some little minor communication problem there because I looked around and there was no one with me. But in a second or two they appeared and we made the assault. Halfway up I took a mortar round shell or fragment in the right or left leg, and I thought I'd lost it, and I spun around a few times and lay down there wondering what was going to happen to me next. The platoon was still moving and firing and ducking, and the friendly artillery was putting white phosphorus, we called it Willie Pete or WP, on the target, and it was spraying around like snowflakes all over the place. I noticed that my people were for the most part hiding behind rocks and trying to pop up and get shots at something, and we were not going to accomplish anything like that. So I got to a position where most of them could see me, and I crawled a few feet, stood up, and told them that we had to get on with it, and I don't know what words I used. I made a gesture, and away we went. There was a Chinese or a Korean, I'm not sure, machine gunner. Fortunately for me, he was between two big rocks, and his field of fire was to the direction away from me and a couple of my people, and they dispatched him in a hurry, and we got to the top, and I do not remember much after that because I hate to admit to passing out, but I faded a little bit, and they dragged me off the hill and sent me back to the hospital. I was in the hospital in in Japan. The evacuation route that I took has never left my memory. The first thing that happened was one of my soldiers sort of hand carried me back to the company CP, which was located behind the hill. At the company CP they had some Katusas who carried me on a stretcher for a long period of time, one in each corner, jiggling along, and if a mortar round or artillery shell hit close by, they'd drop one end or the other. Once they dropped the whole thing. We got to the battalion aid station. At the battalion aid station I was put on a stretcher on a jeep and moved down a road, what they call a road, for several miles to a MASH hospital area. I didn't get in the hospital. I was immediately transferred to a Frontline ambulance, which we refer to as a meat wagon. The meat wagon took me for an hour or so ride, it seemed like, to a railroad station, and we were loaded on a railroad car, a medical car in a train. It was staffed by some of God's angels from heaven. They were American Army nurses in fatigues, but they looked as pretty as any woman ever did. And they were God sent. I asked God actually not to let me die at that time because I hadn't seen a person like that in a long time. The train ride ended in Busan. We were taken again by ambulance to the dock, and we were winched up the side of a gleaming white hospital ship that I want to think today was named the Hope. I have not ever verified it. I've tried to locate someone or some history of it, and I have not been able to do so. From the Hope, where I was operated on a couple of times or a time, we were transloaded to the airfield and flown to Japan. And I spent 2.5 months in a hospital in Japan. The summer was gone by that time, and I returned to the platoon in the fall of 1951. While I was in the hospital in Japan, I was notified of an award ceremony I had to attend when I was able to walk, when I was ambulatory, and I was issued a pair of khakis, a uniform and boots. The little Korean or the Japanese maintenance person there knew that I was a paratrooper, so he shined up a pair of boots better than I could have shined them. And the following morning I participated in a review, I'll call it, it was a standing still parade out on the hospital grounds. To me it was impressive. All those medical people, the local army unit, they had a small army band, and I was on a reviewing stand and not knowing why I should be there. Then I was called to the front and presented with a Silver Star for the battle that I just mentioned to you about the taking of the hill where our people got really into it, almost hand to hand at times when I got wounded. I do recall, as many people probably do, wishing that the people in my little hometown had been at that ceremony. I was called to the platform after the award was made and asked if I would like to say anything. Well, I told them that I knew what it was like to be standing in formation for some reason, and I knew that these medical people would be glad to get out of there, and I did not want to say anything, and I did not want them marching in review, and I just appreciated the opportunity to tell them that, and I thanked them, and that was the end of that. I did make many friends among the medical corps people because I didn't require them to do any more than they did. And so I was the recipient of a Silver Star, which I thought belonged to a lot of other people. I was informed when I got back that the unit had actually put me in for the Distinguished Service Cross, which was far and above what was deserved, and somebody, some rear echelon type who knew better, cut it back to a Silver Star. But in any case, it was more than I deserved, and I made sure that people involved in that action, or any other action subsequently, were acknowledged, and as much as I could do about getting up a written report, which was the big bugaboo. Someone did something in the heat of battle. In order to properly reward him, it had to be written up, and you had to have witnesses and things like that. And it was very difficult to get that done in the field without the equipment or the time or the cooperation of a lot of people, including the Chinese or the Koreans. I returned to the 17th Infantry Regiment Replacement Center in August of 1951, late in August, and I was told that I would be shipped out back to the unit when the transportation was available.
I'm going to stop you for 1 second, okay?
Yes. Yeah. At the 17th Infantry Replacement Personnel Center, I was told I would be sent back to the unit as soon as transportation would be available. I happened to see a truck with the battalion emblem identification on the bumper, and I asked the driver where he was going, and he said he was going back to headquarters company of the battalion. So I got in the truck and I went back, and I got back there without orders or without however you're supposed to process to do that. I checked in the first sergeant, and once again they were in reserve. They had just gotten in reserve, so they would be there for approximately 5 more days. The first sergeant asked me how I was feeling and what would I like to do. Did I have any inclination to going back into the front lines? And I told him I certainly did, and I wanted to get back with my people if they were still around. And he pointed to a location on the side of the hill and said, "There they are, go up there and get them." So I went up and was glad to see what we called then a platoon guide. His name was Wayne Wiley. He had been in the Marine Corps. He came in the Army because he couldn't get promoted in the Marine Corps. He was an exceptional man, an outstanding soldier, and a good combat man. And as my platoon guide, he performed the duties that I would have performed if I'd had a lieutenant as a platoon leader. So he held the thing together during my absence, and fortunately they didn't have any large-scale battles or enemy contact, which wouldn't have made any difference one way or the other, but they didn't. And so I got back my regular platoon with some new people, and some of the old hands had already left. I did at that time encounter a new company commander who taught me another lesson. He never called me in to gain any information I might have on my previous experience. He was new to the command. He was the company commander, but it didn't occur to him that I could maybe give him some information that it would help him with his duties. Not that I necessarily could have, but I thought that he should have debriefed me, if you will, and he didn't. He was not there very long because he got hit in the mouth within a month after that and was evacuated. And we got another one, and we went through that process more than one time. From that time on, war is not routine, but it was routine after a fashion. When you go into the front, you're either in defense or offense. You make an attack, or you're on patrol, or you're back in a trench, or you're back in reserve. And it went like that for the rest of that fall and into the winter. And then one day, I was notified that...
Just want that chair. Okay, it's all right. I know it's difficult, but
it's not difficult. I'm not concentrating. One day I was notified to report to the first sergeant. He informed me that I was being sent to regimental headquarters for some type of an administrative survey or something. I knew he was not telling me the truth, and I told him so. And I told him I didn't feel like going anyway. And he said I did feel like going, and he was not going to put up with the reaction he would get if I didn't go. So the next morning I mounted a jeep and rode back to regimental headquarters, who immediately dispatched me back to division headquarters. And it was at that time I was told I will face a board of officers for the purpose of being commissioned. I had heard this rumblings before that was going to happen. I didn't know why, but being a good soldier, I followed orders. The hearing was held in a tent in a tent city type headquarters area, and I reported to a board of officers consisting of a colonel, two majors, I believe a captain, and a warrant officer who was a recorder. Interesting thing happened to me there. The warrant officer, one of the majors, asked me to leave my weapons outside. I had a pistol and a carbine, 45 and a carbine. And I told him that that couldn't be so because there was no place outside to secure it. The colonel intervened and told me I could stay with the weapons, and I kept them. Then the same major asked me, or said, he didn't ask me, he said, I understand you want to be a second lieutenant. And that was not so. I had never said I wanted to be a second lieutenant. Someone else said I wanted to be a second lieutenant and initiated the process. And I didn't say anything because I didn't want to aggravate this major any more than I already had. Then I thought I would ask if I had to be a second lieutenant, if you had to be a second lieutenant when you got commissioned. And he used an expletive and said, what do you think you ought to be, a general? Well, I didn't answer that either because that would not be too wise, but it wouldn't be a bad place to start, I must say. I left that area. I was dismissed after they asked a bunch of questions about what I would do in situations I had already done, so it wasn't difficult at all. And I returned to the unit that night, and I hadn't heard anything about that for a period of time, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, until I was called off the mountain again and went to battalion headquarters and had a phone call from General Quinn, then Colonel Quinn, and had the second lieutenant bars pinned on by the battalion executive officer. At that time I was informed that the policy in the Army is that a newly commissioned lieutenant in combat does not return to his platoon. He must be reassigned to another unit so to make it easier on everyone. I stated that either I got to go back to my platoon or they got to keep this little gold bars they had. After much huddling and discussing and talking, they sent me back to the company with instructions for the company commander to determine where I would be assigned. I didn't go see him. I went back to my platoon and informed them that any wise remarks or any difficulty I was going to have would not go well with them, and that we were going to continue to march as we always had. That was probably in February, almost a year from the time I had arrived. And before we went back into the mountains, we had a formation, and a general was visiting the area who had commanded, or was the commanding officer of the division, General Firenbaugh, I believe his name was. He was going home, and he was stopping by all the units to visit with them before he departed. He came down the ranks, and being a second lieutenant, caught his eye, and I guess he thought I'd just gotten there because he asked me how long I had been there, and I told him 12 months. And he advised me that I would probably be going home with him. Well, I didn't know whether I was going home with him or not, because I had been told that having been commissioned, I was now obligated to do a commissioned officer's tour. And so I told the general, I said, no sir, I won't be going home. I have to do a tour as an officer. And he discussed it with his aide, and they talked about it a little bit, and they continued with their visit. I was informed that very same day, or no later than the next day, that I would be rotated normally, which would have been like 3 or 4 weeks from that date on. So I did not get back into any more war with anybody, and I rotated home probably in April of 1951 as a lieutenant, as an enlisted man with a lieutenant bars on, expecting in all likelihood I will get some education and training on how this officer corps works, and was assigned for some reason to the 3rd Armored Division in Fort Knox, Kentucky. The regimental commander that I reported to informed me that I was very fortunate that I did not have to go to school. I was getting constructive credit for my time in the service and my time in Korea, and the fact that I had been commissioned. So I commenced a career as a commissioned officer with no instruction whatsoever. After I learned that I would be going home like normal, I didn't get into too much warfare with the rest of the world, but in one skirmish we had, maybe a week or two later, white phosphorus that we were using to in supporting fire sprayed too close to my people, and I got some on my chest, on my fatigues. It burned through, of course. Anyone who's ever been hit or near white phosphorus knows what it does. And it burned through the clothing and scarred my chest a little bit. And obviously it burned very badly. When the time was appropriate, I went back to the company CP and saw the medic and asked him if he could wash it off or put something on it. And he said he did what he could, but he said I should take myself back to the aid station, the battalion aid station, which was further down the mountain. And while I was going, I had to take 2 Chinese prisoners back to the S2. These young people were very slightly built, very young looking to me, uh, pre-teenage almost, uh, frightened of course, and I was in charge of delivering them to the intelligence people. We started down the mountain, and it was maybe in March or so of that 1951. It was not summertime, but it was a deep winter yet, and it was a difficult climb down the mountain. I needed a break, and I had them stop and take a break, and I had cigarettes. I didn't use cigarettes, but I had them because we got them every time you turned around. And I offered each lad a cigarette, and they were very appreciative and bowing and muttering whatever they say. I had to light their cigarettes for them because they obviously didn't have any matches or anything. It didn't look to me at the times I ran into the Chinese, particularly in their wave attacks, that they had anything with them other than their weapons. They had no personal items, no watches or rings or anything that I ever saw, but maybe that's the way they did it. Anyway, these two people did not have. I got to the bottom of the mountain eventually and found the S2 tent and turned them over to a master sergeant in the intelligence section, who immediately roughly shoved one of them, and I advised him that these were harmless young people. They were doing their duty just like we were, and that they were not going to try to escape or injure anybody, and they didn't need to be kicked around. I was informed by the S2 major then that that was their business and I should take care of mine, and they would be able to take care of theirs. I didn't like that, and I made sure it never happened in my command or my area of responsibility ever. Even later on in life in Vietnam, there were many incidents where I thought prisoners were mistreated beyond what was necessary. But that was my idea, not theirs.
Okay, Dan, will you tell us now, we're finished with Korea, tell us what the rest of your career was, with not,
Okay,
going
just-
into detail, how much time you spent in Vietnam, and what rank you achieved, and when you retired, and what rank you retired at, and what units you might have been in during that time. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I returned to the States then in early spring of '51, and while I was at home in Branchdale, Pennsylvania, I received orders to Fort Knox, Kentucky, to the 3rd Armored Division. I didn't question that either, although it didn't sound like a place I ought to be going. I went to the 3rd Armored Division, and that's where I was informed that I would get constructive credit for my career, and I would not be getting any officer schooling at that time. Fortunately, I got the greatest promotion and the best award ever in my life there. I met my wife of 53 years. She was working at 3rd Armored Division headquarters, and I had gone there on occasion, once out of necessity, and after that on an excuse just to be going there. I was transferred to Puerto Rico, to a Puerto Rican infantry training center, who were training replacements for the 65th Infantry Regiment in Korea. I came back after a few months, married my wife, and took her down there, and we had a 2.5-year tour in Korea, in Puerto Rico, as a man and wife. We came back from Puerto Rico, and I was assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division in Fort Lewis, Washington, and they were preparing to go to Alaska on what we called at the time gyroscope. I did not accompany them because I had just come back from overseas. The 8th Infantry Division came in, and General Quinn, who had been Buffalo Bill Quinn, Colonel Quinn in the 17th when I was commissioned, was the commanding general. I had some visits with him and enjoyed some exaggerated war stories that we told. From Fort Lewis, I went to the Advanced Infantry Officers Course at Fort Benning. That was the first officer training I had gotten. It was a 9-month resident course, and it was most beneficial, although I have always contended that the tour of duty with the 17th Infantry Buffaloes in Korea was the most professional, best schooling a soldier could have, and it certainly was mine. From Fort Benning, we went to the 101st Airborne Division in Fort Campbell. From Fort Campbell, we went to Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. From Fort Leavenworth, we went to the 10th Special Forces Group in Bad Tölz, Germany. From Germany, we returned to Fort Bragg to 18th Airborne Corps, went to the Dominican Republic with the Corps staff, returned to the 6th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, joined the 5th Special Forces Group in Vietnam for the year 1968, returned to Fort Bragg, and in 1970 I retired as a lieutenant colonel. In Vietnam, I was the Special Forces Area Commander of I Corps Tactical Zone, which was the northernmost area of South Vietnam, bordering on the 38th parallel, or the parallel between Korea, Vietnam North and South. I had all the Special Forces camps in that area, and I was attached for probably no real reason to the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, who were also located in Da Nang. And that was basically to account for and control all the American units in that area. I got there in early summer of '68. We had some battles that maybe historians certainly know, and maybe some of the public are familiar with. One was Lang Vei, where the camp was overrun. The Khe Sanh Marine Base was in our area, although I had nothing to do with that except to try to visit them on occasion. That's the one that was under siege for so long in Vietnam. The thing about Vietnam, which is, I think, traditional now in the world, our lads, the American soldiers, with their equipment and their supplies and their support, do most of the work. The South Vietnamese youngsters who should have been defending their country found all kinds of reasons to be doing other things, and I was hard pressed to keep from causing a stir by identifying who should be doing what. I had detachments of 8 and 12 American Special Forces soldiers who would command units of 200 and 300 in number, sometimes Montagnards, sometimes Nungs, Chinese Vietnamese, and Vietnamese military. They were fairly decent fighters if you were with them and you were in front and you were leading them. They were not as reliable as you would want to take with you if you were in a serious combat.
Yes.
As I've stated before, and believe with all my heart, the tour of duty with the 17th Infantry was the turning point in my life and my military career. You cannot accompany young people into the most dangerous of situations where they may or may not even survive and not learn to love and associate them as you would your own family. They were funny, they were healthy, they were ambitious. There was never a question of why they were there or why we were there. And at that level, I guess, in my time, we didn't look too far beyond what we were doing and what we had to do and questioned anything. It was the epitome, I thought, of the time of the American youth. I never had a lad not want to go, or had one tell me that he didn't feel like it, or that he had some malady that would make him not able to perform. We joked together, but when time came, it was serious business. I loved mostly when I could get them off the line and we could sit around when you'd get your 2 cans of beer per man, and laugh and talk about things we did or didn't do. I do recall looking at them at times in the wintertime in a trench at night when I would crawl around and make them take off their boots and put their feet under my armpits to keep them from forgetting to take care of their feet, because trench foot could be a very debilitating thing. They used to also ask me if I would take care of the lice that they were collecting and things like that. But it was and I promised them, or they made me promise when I was leaving, that we would get together. And as I sit here today, we never got together.